Establishing flank pressure. This flank opening immediately seeks to control central squares and prepare for a queenside expansion. Opening lines for pawn on e6 grants immediate pawn center control, preparing to develop a bishop. Developing the knight so early to f3 establishes central influence and prepares kingside castling, creating a flexible and solid foundation. Developing the knight to a central square prepares to castle and contests the d4 square, a classic English opening maneuver. Solidifying central control, nc3 prepares to develop the bishop, aiming for a harmonious kingside buildup and potential d4 push. Challenging the center immediately, this advance unleashes central tension and opens lines for potential skirmishes. Instantly, white seizes central space, aiming to build a solid pawn structure and restrict black's piece mobility. Developing the knight to d7 reinforces the e5 square and prepares for potential pawn pushes, maintaining solid central control. Solidifying the center now, white prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square. Preparing a queenside pawn advance with b5 or simply restricting white's bishop on c1, this move solidifies black's pawn structure. Pinching the queenside further, this advance locks black into a cramped shell, demanding careful maneuvering to free their pieces. Solidifying the pawn chain, black concedes a bit of space but prevents white's further queenside expansion and prepares for a central pawn push. Chasing that knight to the rim seems counterproductive, sacrificing valuable time and board presence. Instilling a knight on e4 disrupts white's queenside ambitions and creates an outpost for future black action. Challenging black's knight outpost, this bishop development aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for queenside expansion. Boldly challenging the center, black injects immediate tactical life into this closed position. Shifting the knight to d2 abandons the queenside flank, a necessary sacrifice to prepare for a central pawn push. Exchanging the knight simplifies the position, inviting a more open game and offering a chance to exploit the open d-file. Clearing the bishop's diagonal for increased pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, while preparing for piece repositioning. Pushing this pawn forward sacrifices a tempo to gain crucial central space, although it might leave the king's diagonal a tad exposed. Consolidating the bishop's influence along the diagonal provides essential defensive support and prepares for future pawn advances. Solidifying the central pawn chain and preparing for a queenside expansion, this bishop repositions for active development. Securing the monarch offers vital breathing room, allowing white to consolidate and potentially prepare for a kingside advance. Castling into the heart of the evolving pawn structure aims to secure the monarch while preparing potential counterplay. Challenging the central pawn structure, this advance aims to break black's blockade, potentially opening lines for attack. Pushing the f-pawn opens aggressive lines, but weakens kingside pawn structure. Sacrificing pawn mass for central openness and active piece play. Black recaptures, opening a diagonal for the bishop, and creating a pawn chain that aims to restrict white's queenside. Exchanging the rook on f8 simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the open f-file and potential king weakness. Queen's recapture on f8 now aims to re-establish central influence and prepare for potential counterplay. Unlocking the queen's diagonal aims to pressure black's weakened light squares and control the b6 square. The knight seeks a more active square, potentially eyeing the weakened kingside or supporting a pawn advance. Asserting pressure on the queen side, this bishop repositions to a more active square, eyeing the weakened dark squares around black's king. Reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing a central breakout, black aims to dislodge white's influential bishop. Challenging the queen's retreat, white aims to exploit the vulnerable dark squares around black's king and gain a queenside initiative. A bold attempt to disrupt white's harmonious development, though it sacrifices pawn structure for initiative. Exchanging the bishop clarifies central pawn structure, potentially opening lines for aggressive queen operations. Reclaiming the knight to the center reestablishes a mobile piece, ready to exploit the open f-file and target white's slightly exposed king. Gaining control of the d-file and potentially launching a kingside attack by isolating black's pieces. The queen retreats, seeking a more active post on the 7th rank where it can assist the rook and potentially threaten the opposing monarch. Chasing the knight away initiates a crucial pawn race, aiming to exploit the central advance. Black sacrifices pawn structure temporarily to gain vital central control and pressure the d-file. Sacrificing material for open lines is a daring gamble, potentially exposing your king to a fierce assault. A risky push, this gambles pawn structure for temporary queenside pressure, but leaves the king exposed. Opening the g-file now might lead to an awkward pawn structure, weakening the kingside's defensive cover. Sacrificing material to untangle piece coordination, this captures the pawn opening lines. Opening the g-file offers tactical possibilities, but exposes your king's precarious position amidst black's advancing pawns. Suddenly, the position has opened dramatically, creating tactical skirmishes and a race for initiative on the weakened queen side. Securing the monarch on a more open flank prioritizes safety amidst the unfolding pawn chaos. Reigniting pressure on the weakened kingside pawns, aiming to disrupt white's currently cozy monarch. Initiating a rook lift to potentially reignite the kingside attack and exploit the weakened pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn tsunami, this thrust aims to fracture white's pawn shield and expose the monarch. Gaining central influence and preparing for queenside pressure by consolidating the pawn structure. Consolidating defensive structure, the monarch seeks refuge from the looming storm orchestrated by white's queen. Challenging the advanced f3 pawn creates immediate material imbalance and simplifies the center. Recapturing the pawn offers material equality, but opens the g-file, potentially creating future attacking avenues for white's rook. Opening the g-file dramatically exposes the black king to immediate pressure and potential mating nets. The queen retreats, preserving her presence but abandoning immediate counterplay, allowing white to consolidate. Reclaiming central mobility, this knight repositions to pressure black's pawns and prepare for a potential queenside advance. A cunning gambit to activate the rook, aiming to pry open the kingside, though it invites a potentially dangerous pawn storm. Initiating a knight repositioning, seeking to reinforce the queenside and potentially challenge the d6 pawn. A bold reallocation of the queen, eyeing the e-file and potentially challenging the white king's shelter. Probing the weakened king's pawn shield with a queenside cavalry maneuver. The rook ventures forward, eyeing potential disruptions on the f-file and seeking active participation. Unleashing a decisive check, this gambit opens lines and forces a defensive maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and exploit any lingering king safety issues. Seeking refuge for the monarch amid the storm of activity, a defensive repositioning becomes paramount. Sacrificing the rook opens the g-file, aiming to shatter the king's defenses. The immediate material recovery is crucial, solidifying the rook exchange's positional advantage and initiating an endgame transition. Activating the king brings vital central participation, anticipating a race towards the queenside pawns. A quiet repositioning, the queen seeks a less exposed square to coordinate its forces and prepare for potential pawn advances. Shifting the monarch to safety acknowledges the precariousness of the h-file. Shifting the monarch towards the dangerous queenside flank, though potentially active, invites further complications. A bold queen sortie aiming to exploit the open files and coordinate with the rook for a decisive attack against the exposed black king. Unlocking the queenside's pressure, black aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially infiltrate. Sacrificing the queen finally brings an end to the central chaos, ushering in an endgame where white's king feels surprisingly exposed. The exchange on g4 simplifies the position dramatically, ushering in an endgame where king activity is paramount. Hoping to revive white's attack by forcing the black king further out, but it risks exposing the white monarch. Exposing the king prematurely often leads to swift retribution. This capture opens a direct path for the knight, opening a new avenue for the knight to participate in the ensuing pawn struggle. Navigating the endgame, the king seeks active participation. The king's march toward the center now opens up tactical possibilities for both sides. Activating the king to participate in the endgame skirmish, seeking active squares. Repositioning the knight to the queenside aims to create new attacking avenues and potentially support a pawn push. Pivoting the king towards the queenside offers a surprising avenue for counterplay, aiming to outmaneuver the opponent's rooks. Asserting space on the queenside now seeks to restrict black's passive pieces. Shifting the king forward aggressively aims to support the knight's advance and exploit white's exposed monarch. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to penetrate black's weakened queenside pawns. A strategic repositioning, aiming to consolidate forces on the kingside and prepare for potential pawn advances. Opening a path for the king's advance, seizing more territory. Embracing the open files and potential past pawn, black opts for simplification, leading towards a decisive endgame scenario. Pawn advancements now unlock the queenside, aiming to restrict black's monarch. A cautious retraction, preparing to regroup the knight and explore the central light squares. Opening the b-file creates potential pawn breakthroughs and tactical possibilities. The black king is finally venturing out, seeking active participation in the endgame's final skirmishes. Securing the knight's outposts solidifies your endgame advantage. Consolidating the knight's central influence is paramount before the opponent can exploit any open lines. Positioning the knight to control the critical d7 square and prepare for pawn advances. The pawn's advance creates a potential outpost for the knight, subtly improving black's king's safety in this tense endgame. Asserting control over the light squares after the rook exchange is paramount, aiming to solidify the knight's presence in the center. Pushing the pawn forward creates a passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the open h-file for potential counterplay. Shifting the knight to f2 aims to reinforce the queenside pawn structure and prepare for a potential advance on the kingside or central files. Re-establishing central dominance with the knight is the primary objective now. Bringing the king into the action now, seeking out weaknesses on the queenside for a final push. Recentering the king provides a more secure position, preparing to join the rook's advance along the open file. The king boldly advances, seizing central initiative in this drastically simplified endgame. Relocating the monarch to the center offers a sanctuary from the looming knight's threats. Pushing the king forward opens up new avenues, but invites an immediate challenge to its safety. This maneuver aims to solidify the king's position and potentially prepare for pawn advances, while white's monarch remains exposed. The king abandons its safe square, embracing the center for a final stand against the encroaching pawns. Shifting the king now allows for potential pawn advancement and better board coverage. Pivoting the knight to the third rank aims to re-establish contact with black's isolated pawn and support a potential pawn advance. The king bravely ventures forward, seeking new pastures for activity. Repositioning the knight to support the pawn advance and pressure the weak squares creates a more robust structure. A patient repositioning of the knight, aiming to secure the king and prepare for potential pawn advances or further defensive maneuvers. Initiating a knight raid towards the kingside promises to exploit the isolated white king. The knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the kingside. Exploiting the king's exposed position, this maneuver aims to force a favorable exchange and simplify towards a winning pawn advantage. The knight repositions for a final assault, aiming to disrupt black's remaining pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to f5 offers immediate pressure on key squares and prepares a potential advance. Sensing an endgame shift, black repositions their king to a more secure square, preparing for the likely pawn races ahead. Initiating a decisive king hunt, This maneuver aims to exploit the open diagonals and force black's monarch into a vulnerable position. The knight's retreat to b8 concedes central outpost control, creating potential weaknesses that white can exploit. Focus shifts to activating the knight's penetration, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonals and pressure black's king. The black king seeks refuge on the queen side, hoping to avoid further exposure from the enemy knight. Repositioning the king for a central outpost, aiming to activate it further in the endgame. Securing the king in the corner prevents immediate threats and aims to regroup for a potential counterplay. Activating the king into the fight is paramount now, centralizing it for both defense and potential attack. The king's journey now heads toward the queen side to escape the knight's pressure. The king's aggressive march deepens, aiming to penetrate black's defenses from an unexpected angle. Averting the immediate knight sacrifice on c8 and keeping the pawn structure intact for a potential king infiltration. The king's journey to the center aims to activate its defensive and offensive potential in this simplified landscape. The king bravely steps into the open, seeking shelter on the queen side, a last-ditch effort for survival. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to control the critical central squares and potentially prepare a kingside pawn advance. The black king awkwardly shelters on the edge, a tempting target for the wandering knight. Positioning the knight for a final pounce on the king's sanctuary. Securing the king's escape route is paramount as white's knight prepares to penetrate the queen side. The white king, now exposed on c8, feels the heat from black's aggressive knight.